4 hours of me talking to a room full of reporters and editors. I was in Ghana, I was panicking. I was finally looking at how long my teaching sessions were as a seminar leading volunteer. In the hotel, at the airport, people around me looked cool. Heat had me swabbing my face with a handkerchief. Even the metal finish on my glasses was peeling off. As the air conditioner chugged in my hotel room, I came up with a plan. In the days ahead, with journalists from the Daily Graphic, I would begin my teaching writing experiment. My first step was to make copies of the series of short, feature-style stories I'd slipped in my bag. They'd just appeared in the Washington Post. This was March, before Obama's election. Post reporters wrote 10 pieces about people and the candidates they favored. A scuba diving store owner compared them to sharks. Obama was a silky, according to one story, a sleek, thin, fast-moving shark who sneaks up on you. These stories had humor, scene, context, quirky detail, all this in a few paragraphs. My second step, I asked the 20 or so reporters in the seminar in Accra to read these short stories. We talked about the style. They picked favorite elements. They said they liked this idea of colorful, detailed writing. Ghana was in the midst of its own elections. I asked the reporters to try writing their own versions of these short stories. So they left the building and did man-on-the-street interviews. Then they came back to write. To me, the prose in the Ghanaian newspapers seemed dry, convoluted, dull, not unlike some in the U.S. Could this exercise in imitating a working model help people loosen up and write more fluidly?
I think that's, for me, as a journalist, it is always interesting and challenging to learn about how journalism is practiced elsewhere. It also helps you to share ideas, exchange opinions, and know how to go about it.
I was pleasantly surprised. After an hour or so, folks were ready to read their work aloud. Their evocative pieces included one about disaffected young men drinking at lunch at a nearby eatery. A reporter wrote about one young man who banged on the table and lamented, "Why waste your time to vote?" Then, back at Ohio State, I added to my story writing exercise. I stole an idea from someone else's seminar. The 4 points of the narrative arc as crafted by Berkeley's Center for Digital Storytelling. First, open with a quote that reveals the story's problem, obstacle, or revelation. Second, explain the context of the story. Third, describe the problem/obstacle. Fourth, finish with an insight. This wisdom shaped my own floundering script for a multimedia piece. I was producing it during my time as a journalism fellow at OSU last year. I then tried teaching the 4-point narrative arc with staff from a magazine. The staff had come to OSU for a few days to learn how to produce multimedia. One editor applied the principles of the arc perfectly. Deborah Williams made this story from an interview she'd done at an inner-city Chicago school.
What? You want her to walk? Yesterday, a 5-year-old girl had no way to get home after summer school. And when the principal got in touch with the mother, who was not at home, the mother told the principal to let her walk. Yes, let her walk home from one of the poorest schools in Chicago and 2 blocks away in the Abla housing projects, one of the city's most infamous. One of the school staff decided to walk her home. As a reporter, I decided to go with her, and so does a security guard. Through vacant lots, by boarded-up buildings, by young men sitting on stoops. Catalyst is behind the curve at the moment from telling these kinds of stories that we as reporters encounter on a regular basis. The challenge is, how do we tell these stories that often happen on the fly? How do we tell them in schools that are resistant to us being there and filming these occurrences when they happen? Still, the insight is the possibilities are there.
Next, in my teaching experiment, I combined asking people to read and imitate the story shorts from the Washington Post with the narrative arc explanation. I had a new subject, Liz McClurg. She was a classmate in my creative nonfiction class. She was writing her senior thesis. It was a collection of couples' how we met stories. So with me in tow, she interviewed a pair she found sunning on the quad.
My friend, when we were pledging, we decided we'd get some girls and go to a party and be like, hey, you want to come? So we walked down, we saw their door was open, and we started talking to them.
He was being obnoxious.
And we were just messing around with them.
The opening line was, he was being obnoxious. And that's kind of like the starter, like they didn't like each other. And then after they talked, they kind of liked each other better. When I sat down to write it, I found myself concentrating on the most important bits because I didn't want it. I knew that anything that I wrote with all of the material they gave us would be, 4 or 5 pages long. So I just had to look back at my notes and pick out when I had a full line of dialogue and try to go from there and edit to the most interesting parts.
Angel Cerdan's creative nonfiction class was my last stop in my experiment. Students read the Post short stories. They talked about what they liked about them. Then they interviewed each other. They talked for a half an hour or so about why they wanted to be writers. Then the pairs separated and people wrote for a half an hour or so. Some read their stories aloud. Jessica LaFluen's observations were similar to Liz's.
I personally was surprised at how much mileage I got out of just a 5-minute interview. I found that I felt like by incorporating scene and so much of what Eden said that this could have been pages and pages longer, but focusing it down in such a narrow space really brings out the most important parts. I guess it kind of shows you how to call the most exciting or the most important pieces of your interview and really bring them to light.
His teaching setup helped Jessica focus and refine her work. She could see using this approach in the future. So could I.
I love you, sister girl. I love you, sister girl. I love you, sister. I love you, sister girl. I love you, sister. I love you.